Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're going to get started in just a moment. And while I do that, I'm going to see if I can figure out how to get my screen shared and invite the panelists today to also turn on their cameras so that when I introduce them, you can see who they are. Okay. My screen is shared. Let me make sure I can still see all of the panelists. Yes, okay. All right. Well, thank you for being here today. I don't know whether it's your evening or morning or late afternoon, but either way, we're very grateful for you taking a piece of your busy day to spend some time with us. We're here today to talk about the report that Transformers Foundation launched last week. It feels like longer than that. Here today we have some of the people who, one way or another, have been involved in this report. So before we get started, let me do some quick introductions. We have Abhishek. Abhishek, if you want to give a wave, from Arvind, who participated in this project in the sense that he was interviewed for the report. And we also have with us, and Arvind, I should say, is a manufacturer in India, and Abhishek is calling in from India, and it's 8 o'clock in the evening for him. So thank you for being here this late. And we also have Noreen with us from Crescent Bohemian. Hi, Noreen. And Noreen is based in the US, but Crescent Bohemian is a manufacturer in Pakistan. And they are especially important to this report because they are a founder of Transformers Foundation. And I'll tell you more about what Transformers Foundation is shortly. And of course, without their support and the support of all of our founders, reports like this would not be possible. And we were supposed to have Dr. Siva Pariti from STS Bluewin here with us today. He's actually traveling in Ethiopia at the moment, and he was trying up until the very last minute to submit video responses to some of the questions and the discussion questions that we were going to be having today. But alas, the internet connection was not strong enough and we were not able to get his videos. But I do want to mention his commitment and dedication because he really went to a lot of effort to try and be with us in spirit today. And Dr. Siva was interviewed for the report and was also helped review certain parts of it, especially the technical pieces of it. And we also have Elizabeth Klein here today. Elizabeth is the co-author, one of the co-authors on this report. She is an independent researcher and writer, and also a lecturer of fashion policy and consumerism and sustainability at Columbia University. Brooke Roberts Islam is the other co-author on this report, as well as myself. And I am here representing Transformers Foundation. So before we get into everything, I should tell you a little bit about Transformers Foundation. Transformers Foundation really strives to represent the views of the denim supply chain and its ideas for positive change in the sector. And, you know, our founders, I mentioned Crescent Bohemian is one of them, but our founders really represent all the various aspects of the denim supply chain, from cotton farmers all the way through to chemical suppliers, to mills, to jeans factories, to machinery companies that make and sell the equipment used in denim production. And we were created really with the idea that perspectives from the denim supply chain needed to be better included and heard in conversations around sustainability. So a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. We're going to do questions at the end. So if you have questions as we go along, feel free to put them in the Q&A. and we'll come to them at the end of the session. And I really encourage you to ask questions, any questions. Don't be shy, because that's the best part of these webinars. And I actually think on a housekeeping point, that's it. In terms of the structure of today's session, I'll be giving I'm going to try and be as brief as possible, though it's a long report, so it's not an easy ask, but I'm going to try and give a brief summary of the report, just so that everybody has a shared departure point and a shared kind of understanding of what the report is about. And then we'll try and spend most of today on discussion. Discussion with Abhishek and Noreen, who can speak to these issues, much more concretely than I can. So we'll do discussion, then, as I mentioned, we'll go into Q&A. So this is the report. It's called Towards a Collective Approach, Rethinking Fashion's Doomed Climate Strategy. And I would say in a sentence, but I'm open to other people who, might be better with words than I am. But in a sentence, what I would say is that this report explains how decarbonization has become a supplier rather than a shared responsibility, and why this is inequitable, and also why it won't work. And so we've done that by looking at 3 questions in the report, and you'll see that these questions correspond to different sections of the report. And the first one is, who should do how much? And in brief, what we found in this question of who should do how much is that the current approach to answering this question really is science-based targets. And we outline in the report kind of how this has been institutionalized or operationalized, or how this has become the predominant approach. So I encourage you, if you'd like to know more about that, to go and look at the report. But in a nutshell, what's important to understand is that as a society, we have a collective society-wide goal in the Paris Agreement. And the question is, how do we take the goals of the Paris Agreement, which none of the suppliers participating in the research for this report or Transformers Foundation, or I don't think anyone involved in the report, disputes. I would say the opposite, wholeheartedly endorses and embraces. But how do we take this collective society-wide goal known as the Paris Agreement and distribute responsibility for it to individual companies? And as I said, the sector's current approach to this question is through science-based targets. And I think what's important to understand about science-based targets, and we elaborate on this in the report, is that they take what we call a flat approach to target setting. And what that means is it takes the society-wide goal and sort of distributes responsibility for it to individual companies more or less equally. In other words, all companies have to kind of more or less contribute to this goal to the same extent and at the same pace. Elizabeth, is there anything you want to add on that before I go into our findings as to why suppliers said it was problematic for them?
Oh, just that that the science, the climate science that undergirds the sorry guys, I'm still waking up. The Paris Agreement is 50% reduction roughly in emissions by 2030, and with the goal of reaching net zero by 2050. So science-based targets is about taking that collective goal and assigning that same set of targets to individual companies.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So when we went out and we talked to denim suppliers, they raised 2 issues with this approach. The first is that although it seems equal because you have kind of all companies doing their part, they felt it really was not equal. And the reason that they felt that was that, by some estimates, more than 90% of a brand or retailer's emissions is in their scope 3. And within scope 3, about 80% of emissions are concentrated in the making and manufacturing of raw materials and apparel. In other words, although it seems equal, it in fact requires a lot more work from producers and from manufacturers, many of whom are based in the global south, which then also raises the issue of margins and profitability, because what you see then is that most of the work is that, when you take a sort of flat approach to target setting, most of the work has to happen in the supply chain and precisely in the locations that maybe are not getting the majority of the margins or the profit in the apparel supply chain. So that was the first issue that was raised. The second issue that was raised was kind of unrelated to equity. We had a lot of suppliers say to us, this is also just not feasible, because the extent to which a company can decarbonize, or let's say its opportunity space from a decarbonization perspective, is contingent upon so many contextual layers that sort of shape the extent to which a company might be able to decarbonize, from where they are to what type of production they're running to maybe, what their company has or hasn't done so far, that all of these sort of contextual factors would make a sort of one-size-fits-all approach to target setting very difficult, because some companies and some manufacturers will be able to do more easily than others. And that our approach to target setting really needs to take this into account. Now, just to briefly to paint a picture, I'm not going to go into this, but in the report, we actually sort of, from a feasibility perspective, look at two different strands of options. We look at the feasibility of switching to alternative energy sources, and we look at the feasibility of energy efficiency gains, so using less energy. And we sort of explore a couple of different pathways within both of these strategies, and share some of what the denim suppliers that we spoke to told us about how contextual factors would shape the extent to which any of these things, which you see on screen here, would be viable for them or not. We're not necessarily endorsing any of these approaches, just trying to shed light on how contextual factors might influence a producer's ability to deploy any one of them. So we'll hear more about that in a moment from Abhishek and from Noreen, excuse me. Elizabeth, is there anything you want to add that I have missed before I go on to who pays? No? Okay. So the second question that we looked at is who pays? And what we found was that the current approach to this question is actually that it is this question, I should start by saying this question is rarely explicitly asked. And it is, I think, presumed that it is the producers and the manufacturers who will foot the bill, because as I just explained, most of the emissions are in the supply chain. So it's sort of presumed that because that's where the work has to happen, that those are also the same entities who should foot the bill. And in the paper, we give sort of an overview of the different sectoral approaches to financing decarbonization and elaborate on that more. So if you're interested in that, I encourage you to go and look at the report. But in our research, what the denim suppliers that we spoke to flagged was that they identified two different types of funding needs. They said, we have short-term payback projects that will generate a return, and these are investments that we would hypothetically be happy to make. And we also have projects that have extremely long, or in some cases, no paybacks. And across both of these two different funding needs, we have different struggles in terms of availability of funding. So is there just enough money available to fund the types of expenses, or investments rather, that we're trying to make? They also raised issues about access. So they said, even if a project does have payback, in some cases, we're unable to access the financing. And then they also raised issues about affordability, because, saying, and in some cases, this was about interest rates, that the interest rates were too high. But in some cases, it was about, that some of these investments actually increased their operating expenses, and that they were not able to secure a higher price to help cover those increased operating expenses. And I should also say that the suppliers we talked to really stress that this is both a CapEx and an OpEx issue, that, it's not just about the upfront investment that's needed, but it's also about the impact that some of these investments have on operating costs and the ability to then sort of be able to pay for that as well. On the who and what drives change question, the current approach, what we found in the report is that the current approach to this question is that it tends to be presumed that change has to be top down. It has to come from the brands or from even the consumers and sort of be who have to sort of put a particular vision or a way of working on the supply chain. And what the suppliers that we spoke to shared with us was that this poses a problem for two reasons. First, it results in a one-size-fits-all approach to decarbonization, which when you sort of factor in these layers upon layers of contextual factors that shape the extent to which a company might or might not be able to decarbonize, leads to requests to do things that in a particular context may just not make sense. So there were, a number of suppliers who shared that they were being asked to do things that just didn't make sense or were not possible in their context. And the second issue, which I think is really much more fundamental that was raised, was that this top-down brand-led approach to decarbonization has really impacted the way that the issue itself has been framed. And they said, the fact that decarbonization and climate action have become synonymous is actually indicative of this top-down approach. Because if you were to include more producers in this conversation, there would be a lot more emphasis on things like adaptation and resilience, given that we employ some of the people most vulnerable to climate change, and given that we are located in some of the countries and locations most vulnerable to climate change. So in brief, those are the three questions that we looked at in the report. We also looked at regulation, and we didn't do a comprehensive mapping of the regulatory or legislative landscape, but we looked at 3 examples of global north legislation to kind of get a sense of where do they fit into this picture. And we looked specifically at the CSDDD, the CSRD, and the Fashion Act in New York. And what we found, again, this is very simplifying it, but that what we found is that all 3 of the legislative efforts that we looked at emphasize and in some cases mandate science-based targets as a primary tool to reduce emissions or to demonstrate action around climate change in the private sector. So in other words, what we're seeing is that there's a very real risk of putting this approach that denim producers told us is not working into law. So we conclude the paper by calling for a collective approach. And we offer a definition for what that should be. We define collective action as shared ownership and shared responsibility, and suggest that this requires shifting responsibility for climate action from suppliers. And I think, as I said at the outset of this presentation, one of the contributions of this paper is to sort of articulate how and why responsibility for climate action has become a supplier burden, but shifting responsibility for climate action from suppliers to one that's shared across the value chain. Climate action must be our problem. And the first step we suggest towards this end is decoupling this question, who should do how much, from who pays. So this word decoupling is really just a fancy way of saying that just because the work has to happen in production, because again, as I said at the outset, we can't change the fact that so many of the emissions are in the supply chain, that just because that's where the emissions are and that's where the action has to happen, that shouldn't automatically mean that they are the entities also responsible for footing the bill. We also give a very practical example of what a collective approach is versus one that isn't. So for example, we could have a collective program might be, a program where all value chain actors contribute a certain percentage of their revenue, and on the screen it says 1%, but this is really just as an example, but a certain percentage of revenue to some kind of joint fund. An example of a program that's not collective might be for a brand lending money to a supplier. And the reason that wouldn't be collective is because at the end of the day, it's still the supplier that takes the project risk and the credit risk, and it's still the supplier who pays that loan back. So they're still, at the end of the day, the ones footing the bill. So this is just to sort of, I think, open people's imaginations to what we mean by this. And with that, unless any of my panelists want to add to what I have shared, I would like to go into the discussion. Anything anyone wants to add? No? All right, then I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that you can see all of the panelists a little bit better. And I want to jump right in. And I want to ask Abhishek and Noreen, I mean, do you think that suppliers are under pressure to set science-based targets? And how does this actually play out or manifest in your opinion or in your experience?
Thanks, Kim. Maybe I can start and now you can add that. So, yes, I think since almost about 3 to 4 years, when the fashion industry really started sort of serious efforts towards tackling climate change and decarbonization, we've been facing varying degrees of sort of requests or mandates or asks from our customers. And it has been in the form of, like initially, if I talk about sharing the data, which of course we are all happy to, then setting targets, in some cases science-based targets, or in some cases targets which brands have decided to sort of achieve through their supply chains. Uh, and then there's been instance of some secondary targets, so like eliminate coal by 2025 or eliminate coal by 2030, which is sort of not really as something which is there in science-based target as such, but that's a separate sort of initiative that some of the brands have taken. And I think in most cases, we would never heard anyone asking us that what is our target to reduce GHG emissions and how we'll be going to achieve it, how we are doing. I think the last few years have been more focused on pushing the targets into the supply chain. And then sort of in one case also, of course, without naming anyone here, but in one case, a brand has taken a science-based target of 45% for the supply chain, and they are pushing 70% reduction target on the supply chain because the rationale is that the brand expects to grow by 2030 by another 50-60%. So the actual emissions they have to reduce is 70%. So they're asking supply chain to reduce 70% because they want to grow their business and volume by the equivalent amount. So there have been different cases, and I think the challenging part has been also the compulsion associated with it. So if we don't set targets or if we don't reduce, then potential to lose business. And second, being industry not being uniform in their action. So even science-based targets that we've seen from different brands are ranging between 30% to 55%. So that means like especially large suppliers are part of at least 10 to 15 brands supply chain. So what do you do as a supplier? So that is something is still a mystery to us.
Thank you, Abhishek. And I'm going to hand over to Noreen. And Abhishek, while Noreen answers that, we had a comment that some people were struggling to hear you. And I wonder if maybe you have like headphones that you could plug in. But I'll let you take a look at that. And Noreen, over to
Right.
you.
Thank you. I will build on what Abhishek already shared. Similar to what he shared, we have been hearing about science-based targets and setting some goals related to that in the last 3 to 4 years, more specifically. And again, building on what Abhishek has shared in terms of his experience, we have also seen that the conversation or the one-way conversation in a way started around about at that time, and then over a period of last 2-3 years, there's been more added to it in terms of renewable energy, the percentage of your renewable energy shifting that is being required. Initially, it was renewable energy. Now it's renewable electricity. We have, of course, those targets are being discussed and all, but in terms of the pathway to that, how that is going to happen, there's been more or less I would not probably go to the extent, no, a very, very limited conversation or a discussion around that. So as those, especially, I want to go back to the fact that, science-based target is, in terms of setting goals really linked to that is, as a sector, we've been trying to understand what science-based means actually as a supplier. And this is something where we've been wanting to have a conversation, and I do believe I speak for a number of suppliers and not just one in this case, where we've been stumbling and in terms of to reach an understanding in terms of what it means to set a science-based target. So resources available, the opportunities available to discuss all that have been extremely limited. There's been conversations, one-on-one in certain places, but as an industry, we have not yet spoken about it. In my experience, I have not seen much of that happening. So this is something that, when we look at this report, what we're trying to say as an industry is totally resonates with, with the suppliers across the board, that what are we trying to achieve here? Other than, you want to set a goal, how is that goal relatable to you as a supplier? How are you going to not just, of course, set the goal, but how are you going to get to that goal? And that context-specific discussion is not taking place. So this brings us to that, okay, so how does this play out? Do we have, and I know later in the webinar, we'll get to that, is that how does it play out for suppliers at the national level, at the sector level? Do we really get those opportunities to talk about that? Talking about renewable energy, there's been all these questions and discussions as to what is other than going solar, what are the other options, what are available to go renewable, and what are the availabilities at the local level in terms of access to such energy sources. So science-based targets is again coming back to is something that we have felt that as suppliers we have very limited understanding of what it means, other than setting a certain percentage or a ratio to achieve by a certain time. That's just a goal. But to your point, Kim, what you earlier highlighted, and we talk about that in the report again and again, is that it's not just about setting a target, it's about reaching that target as well. So I'll just pause at that.
Thank you, Noreen. Elizabeth, is there anything that you want to add or follow-up questions on this point for Abhishek and Noreen?
I mean, I can add, just because, our role as co-authors was to synthesize what all of the suppliers surveyed in the paper were saying. And so I'll just build on what's been said here, which is that over the last 4 years, there's been a 4-fold increase in the number of brands and retailers in the apparel and textile and footwear sector that have set science-based targets. So as they, Noreen and Abhishek have described, this expectation has come about very quickly. And the way that the Science-Based Targets Initiative requires brands and retailers to set targets is in a sector like apparel, where most of the emissions are in the supply chain. When you're a brand and retailer that is setting a target, you're setting it for the entire value chain. So, that's inherent to the process. A brand and retailer that's setting a target is setting it for companies that, Abhishek and Noreen would be working for. The other thing that suppliers were saying is that in addition to brands and retailers then coming to suppliers and saying, okay, we've set this target, so now you have to help us meet it, is that there's this growing expectation that suppliers themselves set their own science-based targets. And probably the most concrete example of that is the Sustainable Apparel Coalition's facility environmental module. The latest update of that actually asks factories if they've set their own science-based target. So we're starting to see more examples of pressure and expectation on suppliers to set these targets. And then the other thing is, again, these targets are coming from the Science-Based Targets Initiative. I just want to make the distinction that the paper's not disputing climate science. It's that the Science-Based Targets Initiative decided to break the collective goal into an individual goal for all companies. And that was not something that was decided on collectively. It was not decided by, certainly not decided by the supply chain. Yeah, I just wanted to make that distinction.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And I think on that note, Abhishek and Noreen, I would be very curious to hear from you some concrete examples because of contextual factors that might shape a factory or a manufacturer's ability to meet a science-based target. And this is actually related to a question. We haven't opened the Q&A, but I'm going to read this question out because I think it's related to this this topic that we're on right now, which is a question from Michael Sadowski, who asks, "It seems to me that the issue is not necessarily with science-based targets or SBTI, but rather one of equity. That is, brands and retailers not sharing in the investments needed to transition suppliers to a low carbon future." And the reason I think this question is relevant is because I think one of the things that we heard from suppliers loud and clear in the research for this report is that, yes, this is an issue of equity, but it's also an issue of feasibility, and that the extent to which a factory can or cannot decarbonize is really contingent upon a lot of contextual factors that might be outside of their control. So I'm curious whether Noreen and Abhishek, you can give some examples of this in your context, or maybe that you've seen that might sort of speak to this feasibility issue.
Maybe I'll go first this time. So few things, and we've been having this discussion in several forums and individually as well, is the context, of course, where we are situated, what kind of access do we have to, of course, the first one is renewable energy. Is there enough available locally? Can we have access to that? Then, of course, how much does it cost? Like any other business organization, we have operational costs as well. Everybody has those. So, and in terms of our energy mix, how do we decide what to purchase? And, based on two main things. One is, of course, the availability. And the second, of course, along with that is the cost of it. So while we are making investments, and I see not just us, of course, but many other suppliers switching to solar, for example, but that how much can we install? It depends on how much space we have. Do we want to have batteries as well, or do we want to have just the panels? If you, for example, go for the batteries as well, not every supplier may want to, other than, let's suppose, if it's available as well, may want to go towards that as well, because the once you need to discard them, how do you discard them? What are the logistics? What are the operational challenges related to that? For example, the other piece is that as a supplier sitting in Pakistan, again, going back to what kind of energy mix we have access to, we have natural gas as well in Pakistan also, but in the last few years, there's been limited availability in certain times of the year. So there is a huge challenge in terms of how much industry gets as well, because there is obviously domestic consumption, consumers as well. So then we also have, in terms of technical know-how, technical capability, having, not just the sustainability teams, but the engineering teams within our own, for example, setup, people who are capable of understanding, climate and looking at not only just going into renewable, but again, looking at our own energy efficiencies as well. How do we, and this is something I know that the report talks about as well, that how can we, other than, everything is not just about spending money and getting new equipment and all, but how do we look at internal processes? How do we optimize those? We need technical capabilities to be able to do that. And we are doing it, we will do it. But at the same time, we have challenges. Again, talking about how do we, look at different portions of it, because there is no one pathway, and that's the other challenge that we coming back to, is that what is the pathway? I think as a supplier a certain pathway, and I want to take that. But if there is a goal set for me saying that I have to go 50% renewable, and there is a specific time frame to it, I cannot get to that time. I already know I'm behind, and in all likelihood I'm going to miss that target. But is there a space to have that conversation? No. So I'll take a pause here. I can go on and then on and on, but I'll let Abhishek add in his bit as well.
Yeah, I think we've seen several examples came now of not sort of properly contextualizing the ask, and some of the most simple ones being even the baseline year. So different brands ask us to adopt different baseline years. So it becomes very hard for us to track. Somebody says, I have taken 2019 baseline, so my supplier should also take 2019. Similarly, somebody says 2020 or 2021. So there's no sort of sanctity of a baseline which, as a supplier, somebody has taken on their own and set their own targets. So that is first one. Second, as Lauren mentioned, in different geographies, we have different fuels and different fuel mixes. In India, for example, natural gas availability is very low and also very expensive at the same time. And the government prioritizes natural gas to be used for certain sectors and not particularly for textiles. So there and with that, if you have a requirement imposed of eliminating 100% coal by 2025, there's no practical way to achieve it in such a short span of time. Then, of course, as we mentioned, several countries have not enabled net metering or PPAs as an instrument, which again is a big challenge. So a lot of practical work needs to happen, which is more geography specific, which is more sort of contextualized. Even in large countries like India and China, there could be different things applicable in different geographies. So we need for larger countries more regional level information. I think those things would come, but right now everybody's too busy pushing the targets and sort of trying to set targets in the supply chain, and not so much focusing on how and when these targets could be achieved practically and in a manner which is also financially feasible.
Thanks, Abhishek. Elizabeth, is there anything you want to add on this point? And there's no pressure.
I wrote a few notes down. I mean, I think that, you know, as we were writing the paper, we also had this debate amongst ourselves, like whether or not the target setting process was the problem. I do think that in order to address equity, this is my opinion, it's not necessarily reflected in the paper, but in order to address equity, we also would have to rethink the target setting process, you know, because so much of the pressure right now is on the supply chain to decarbonize. Most of those actors are in the global south. I also think that it is, and again, this is my opinion, and others can you know, weigh in on this, it is actually really important for targets to not be realistic, but to be based in reality. So, you know, that means you look at the supply chain and say, here's the potential to decarbonize, and we set the targets against that. And one thing that we do say in the paper is that what that means is that some actors can actually decarbonize at a much higher rate than the current targets. And other actors, just the potential is not there for a million different technical and contextual reasons. And the other thing that I think that we were concerned about is that the focus on target setting, it does seem to, in practice, have undermined what we all know, which is that climate action has to be collective. It seems to be pushing everybody's attention and focus back to individual companies and what are individual companies doing. And it's in a way, it's like preventing these kinds of conversations from happening, which is how do we all get together and solve this as an industry?
Thank you. So I want to turn, because we've been talking about the money aspect, so I want to turn to that a little bit more directly, and ask, whether you would be willing to give an example of a long payback or a no payback investment, but that you'd like to make, but maybe can't, and to just share with us a little bit about what the barrier might be. Is it access to capital? Is it additional operating expenses, or something else? And I'll ask you to be brief, because I want to open to for Q&A, and I still want to get to also what do we mean by collective approach. So I don't know, Noreen or Abhishek, which one of you would like to take this?
Yeah, I can go first. Ideally, see, best way to one of the ways to sort of incentivize climate action is to put a price on carbon, and that is what, for example, has happened in EU also successfully, where industries in EU have to have certain allowances, and if they are emitting more, they have to purchase the allowances. So similarly, if a brand X is responsible for example, 10% of my emissions, and if I'm asked to reduce those emissions, I should be paid as a price of carbon to reduce those emissions. And then every year, sort of till the time they work with that factory, they would pay for reducing the emissions in per ton of carbon. And it takes away some of the challenges, like brands don't want to invest in a factory because they are not sure whether they will work their second year or third year or after a few years or not. And it takes also other challenges associated with whether CapEx or whether OpEx needs to be paid. So one is that, of course, other challenges is still being how to operationalize this aspect. And some of the other, I think other thing you asked was about the long payback or no payback options. So for example, if I have to move away from coal to biofuel, so biofuel is currently more expensive than coal. So not only I have to invest in a new boiler, I have to also every year meet higher operational cost by buying more expensive biofuel. And the fear that is always there is about the longevity of business. So if I invest in a new boiler, switch to a higher cost fuel, my cost of production will go up, and then the same brand perhaps may find more expensive and buy from a cheaper place, which may still be using coal. We've seen some of those happening earlier when, if I invest in water recycling, my cost of production goes up. And then I suddenly am more expensive, few cents more expensive than my counterpart who's not invested in water recycling. So that is one of the biggest fears that's there in the supply chain. What if I'm then sort of more expensive and brand wants to move to another geography or another supplier?
Thank you, Abhishek. And quickly, Noreen, and then I have one last question about collective approach, and then we're going to open it up for audience Q&A, because I know there's a lot of good questions coming in.
Right. So I'll not repeat what Abhishek mostly, I wanted to talk about that as well. But one thing I do want to add is, for example, and we use biofuels as well for our boilers and all that. And there is, like any other process, every process has a byproduct as well. So when you talk about technical capabilities and all that, so for example, when we use these other fuels as well, so there is there is a consequence of that process as well. So in terms of technical capabilities to address those issues as well should also be, we feel, that part of the conversation also, because as we are exploring renewable energy, what is available and all that, but there are biofuels as well, which again have their emissions also, but they are in terms of the comparison, if I may, that they are still an option that a supplier can use. So, and there is jury still out there. I mean, when you look at, earlier we talked about HIG and the latest 4.0 module that's come out as well. There are segments that are being enhanced to deal with that as well. But coming back to conversations with the buyers and brands as well, the conversation on the biofuels also needs to take place, because right now the jury is still out there whether biofuels will be considered as a option for renewable energy as well as a source. So.
Thank you. And I want to ask you whether you have examples of a collective approach that you've seen, that you like, that you'd be willing to share, or maybe you have a hypothetical one. And this actually relates directly. I'm going to bring in an audience question because there's a question from Astrid Leesens. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. I apologize. Who asks, what would be a good way for a brand to approach setting SBTs while taking into account their supplier's point of view? What topics would need to be covered? Cost, timeline? Would it be beneficial for the Science Based Target Initiative to add a minimum requirement that organizations that have their Scope 3 higher than 40% to already have a better defined plan that needs to be approved to make sure suppliers are included in the conversation? So maybe your thoughts on maybe an example of a collective approach, and in giving that example, maybe you can speak to some of the questions or the points that Astrid has raised. Noreen?
I do not have a specific example of where I've seen a collective approach, to be honest. But what I can hypothetically speak to is the opportunity to be able to have a conversation and have a space where we can talk about having a differentiated approach. We do want to, I mean, again, we can't emphasize enough that it's not that we don't want, I mean, we're not going to do that, try and look at our, carbon footprint and, all the investments that we're making as a supplier to switch to cleaner energy. But can we have that conversation where we can say, okay, these are in terms of the context specific challenges that we have, we just shared and talked about. So can we have some differentiated approach in terms of, okay, this is maybe not 40%, we can get to 30%. Is there a space to be able to talk about that and to create those spaces as well, where you bring in not only just challenges, but because when you discuss only, then the solutions will come. Only setting a target does not get you anywhere, but the pathway to that. So what are the challenges that I would have as a supplier in the country where I'm sitting in? What is available, what is not available? And then looking at, okay, so again, going what it would cost and how much can we absorb, how much do we share? So those conversations, if, in terms of what I would like to see as a collective approach, like to take place, that's what I would like to see.
Thank you, Noreen. Abhishek, anything you'd like to add here or share?
Suggestion is very good here to sort of ask organizations who have more than who have a large share of Scope 3 emissions to do more, and to demonstrate what they are doing to engage the suppliers, as well as helping them to reduce some kind of emissions, or taking the collective responsibility. I think we've seen some of this in the food industry, where a lot of the work is done by large food processing industries in helping the farming communities to move to regenerative agriculture, for example. So I think that similar approach would be useful.
Thank you, Abhishek. And Elizabeth, anything from you on this point, or no? All right, I'm gonna go up to, we're gonna try and get to as many questions as we can. There's one question from from Jeff Nichols. You do realize that natural gas is a fossil fuel. I see Elizabeth has answered that in the chat already. I think what I will just say on this is that, you know, as a manufacturer, you have a certain range of levers that you can pull to reduce your emissions, depending on, you know, where you are. And we're not necessarily saying or endorsing any one lever or another, but the reality is that there are certain things that I think a producer can potentially do to reduce their emissions. And if they're currently reliant on other fossil fuels that are more heavily or are more emissions intensive, then this is one of those levers. Is it a long-term solution? No, but it is potentially one of the levers at a producer's disposal. Abhishek or Noreen, and there's no pressure, but is there anything you want to add to this question, or?
Yeah, I fully agree here. Natural gas is not a preferred solution at all, and I think this is where I mentioned that if you're blindly pushing the supply chain to eliminate coal, the only option for them is to say move to natural gas in the short term, especially, which is a very wrong decision, and it makes an investment, making an investment in natural gas boiler and then natural gas would then not any other solution that comes up, say in 8 to 10 years, it would not the supplier would not be willing to then shift again from natural gas because they've already invested. So I think we should avoid these mistakes, and natural gas, of course, there are various reports showing that the emissions from natural gas in upstream, especially during extraction and transportation of natural gas, are much higher than what is embedded into the current emission factors. So, but the problem here is that there is such a push to eliminate coal at any cost at a given moment. So, hence many suppliers we see are taking that step to move to natural gas, which is a very short-term solution.
I agree. Sorry, just very quickly, and going back to what we've been saying again and again, is that what are the options? What's the different sources that are available to you where you're sitting? So sitting in Pakistan, of course, is we have access to natural gas, and yes, we've already talked about this. Is not, but at the same time, based on what we have currently in terms of energy mix, so and what is available, so we have to take that decision also, and because there are some absolute no-goes. So till you get to where you get to, so you've got to stay operational as well. So how, and while we invest on, for example, solar, we look at biofuels and all. So at the same time, we also have to make those calls and make those investments or not make those investments as well. So those things you as individually, every supplier obviously has to deal with. So while you are dealing with that, there are decisions that you are making along the way, and once those investments are made or not made, that the time keeps ticking. So that's going back to the need to have that discussion and that conversation, and go beyond just setting those goals. We've talked many for the last 3-4 years about those goals and goals only, but how do you operationalize those goals?
Thank you, Noreen. I'm going to go to the first question on the Q&A box because this person has been waiting patiently for about half an hour. And this is a question from, again, I apologize for the pronunciation, but Unati Balair. And the question is, if brands are instructed to spend for the operational upgrades, and they decide to change their suppliers or install their own factories, suppliers are still at risk. How possible is this scenario? How to safeguard supplier interests? So I think this question is actually about, if a producer makes an investment, how likely or possible is the scenario that then, after having made all of these spends on operational upgrades, that a brand would decide to switch their supplier. Who would like to take this one? Abhishek?
This is definitely a really which I also pointed to. So there could be, and there have been instances in the past when suppliers have been asked to invest in factory upgrades or water recycling or any infrastructure upgrades or safety upgrades, and then the cost of production goes up, and in any case, the relationships are very transactional in nature. So you could have business 1 year from one brand, and next year it could be completely gone. So that is why, because of the short-term nature of industry, we are not in electronics industry like where if Apple is asking you to manufacture iPhone, they will give you like a 10-year contract, or they'll ask you to set up a specific factory for them. So this is indeed a real risk, and I think that is why mitigation is more when there are infrastructure upgrades, if there's more upfront finance available, and also linked to long-term business. I think what could really also help is just commitment on the business side. So there are many actions which suppliers can take on their own as well without financing, but there's no commitment to getting more business if a supplier is more sustainable. So that linkage is missing. So if I reduce my emissions by 50%, would I get more business? So that link we don't see yet. So which could in itself solve a lot of investment challenges.
And
Thank you.
sorry,
Yeah,
just
please.
adding very quickly. So while obviously the relationship is very transactional, but at the same time, we also see, and again, the volumes can, shift, go up and down over a period of time. But at least for a certain segment, we see that there are long-term relationships. There are, between the suppliers and the buyers, there are, for a certain segment or for a certain tier. So maybe again, not right away, but there is a portion where one can start or where one can actually have that meaningful impact. So, and again, everything cannot be done in just one day or in one way, but there is again, that segment where those relationships exist. So and those conversations can and should take place within that, and then the rest can follow. And that's basically, those are the first, that is the raindrops, or the first where you see that change happening.
Thank you, Noreen. I'm conscious of time, and for those of you who'd like to stay on another 5 minutes, we'll try and get to a couple more questions. But for those of you who have to hop off, I just want to thank you for coming and spending a piece of your busy day with us. And I'd like to thank Abhishek, Noreen, and Elizabeth also for being so willing to come and answer questions and speak candidly, because it's not always easy. And I am going to try and get to another question or two, but just in case, I want to give the floor to Noreen and Abhishek and Elizabeth. Is there anything that you'd like to say before people start to drop off that you haven't had a chance to say? And there's no pressure, but just a chance.
I think maybe to sum up, I think suppliers are more than willing to take action, but and we have some success stories of collective action as well. We've had an investment from a brand in one of our factories, which has helped to offtake almost 80% of the cost of investment in a grant mode instead of debt. So there are some or a very few case studies in the industry, but that needs more and more. Instead of like one or two cases, we need hundreds of such cases. And I think that there's enough time already spent on talking and discussing about targets, as well as a lot of technical capacity building and stuff. Now, really, if we look at 2030, we are already in 2024, so we have 5 or 6 years to achieve some of these targets, which is already a very short time for all the capital expenditures and long gestation period projects. So we should be shifting gears now from sort of target setting to actual implementation if we are really serious about achieving these some of these tough targets.
And I will just probably add, what I would add to that is that, I mean, just going back to that, target setting alone is not going to, we are already behind schedule. And I'm not just talking about the sector, I'm talking about the whole world. At the country level, at the government level, within our own sector, we are already behind. And if we don't have those conversations, we will still be here in the next 5 years. So if we can have those conversations, and it's okay to have those conversations, because this issue is not simple issue. And if we try and oversimplify it by giving the same target to everybody, it is not helping us in any way. So, and we need to have those conversations. That's the emphasis eventually.
Elizabeth, anything from you?
I'll just add that there are a lot of good questions in the chat about, different ideas about decarbonizing the supply chain. There's one about solar steam, the one about natural gas. I just encourage everyone to, I know it's a long report, but to read the report. Chapter 1 in particular goes into these technical energy related roadblocks that suppliers are facing. I think that one place the industry could start is by thinking through, if we were to look at each of these roadblocks in the supply chain, what would it look like if the industry came together to solve those pain points. The paper, I think, is really clear in terms of what is standing in the way, in addition to targets, like all of these actual technical roadblocks that are in the supply chain. So my final point is please read the paper.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And if it's all right, I'm going to do one more last question for people who want to stay on, and it's from Ruth McGlip. And her question is there a danger that brands could weaponize or somehow scapegoat the supplier perspective and set less ambitious targets, or backtrack on targets, or avoid accountability while ignoring the important takeaway of collective action and strong financial support? With feasibility by location taken into account. I'm curious if you've had any feedback from brands about the finding of the report. Ruth, I'm happy to speak to you about the last part of your question offline, but Abhishek and Noreen, would either of you like to take Ruth's question? Because I know both of you are also very passionate, if I may use the term, climate activists yourself, and that this is the last thing that either of you would want to see happen.
I mean, we've often seen, and I think Noreen can speak more to it, because she's had longer experience as well as more on the social side as well. So in social side, whenever there's an issue in supply chain, it's always branded like this was the industry, or even at country level like industry in this particular country is not sort of good, or wages are low, or laws are not strong, or health and safety is not good. So some of these incidents have been used to paint the supply chain or the suppliers in bad light, and we really struggle to sort of come out of those images which have been built by Western media or by some of the other constituents in the industry. So it could very well happen in the climate change if by 2030 if we are still talking about targets, or if we have achieved the 20% instead of 40%, the easiest sort of call out would be the supply chain, or the supplier didn't do enough in terms of production. So this is a very valid comment there.
I think one of the, just very quickly adding to what Abhishek shared, one of the things, and it's interesting you shared the social example as well. We put everybody in the same boat. I'm not saying that the issues are not there. They're there, but there are good players and there are bad players. Sometimes there are challenges that they certainly exist, but at the same time, to put one, take it or look upon it as just one, that this is the snapshot, this is the picture, and everything is bad, and this is what happens. So these are, and the narrative, unfortunately, the negative narrative grabs more attention. The challenges linked to that, especially now with the climate change, the whole world, the whole globe is facing this. So it cannot be just one supplier or one brand or one country issue. And that is the reason that it's not that we don't take it seriously. We're making those investments. We're enhancing our capabilities, but at the same time, we're crying out loud as an industry that we do need help. And just to kind of, eventually, when you don't get there, you already know that you're not going to get there. So there is a chance that will happen, and it happens already. So that's why we're saying that these conversations need to take place. Can't emphasize enough. I think I keep saying that again and again. But there is a chance that could happen. But I think we need to look at the realities as well. We have to.
All right. Well, on that note, I thank you all for your time, and everybody on the webinar for staying on over time. And I know there's some questions that we didn't get to, and we'll do our best to come back to you with those responses by email. But thank you very much for your time, and I really appreciate everybody's participation today, including the panelists. So on that note, I'm going to close this session, but I would echo Elizabeth's call. Please do go and read the report. I know it's long, but I hope it will. I think it will be worth your while. So on that note, thank you very much. Have a good day, a good evening, depending on where you are. Abhishek, thank you for being on so late with us. And until next time.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.